What's up guys, this is TheKephas, and in this video I am going to showcase some macros that I have created for World of Warcraft with the use of a mod called Gnome Sequencer Enhanced. This mod allows you to create macros that can perform most, if not all, of your rotation with one button, which can be extremely useful for individuals like myself who have a disability, or for those who just want to be lazy. But you are still required to press buttons, control your character, and make choices, which means that using this mod does not violate the terms of service. Today we're going to talk about Blood Death Knights, but before we can understand how the macros work, let's first take a look at how the class is played. For Blood Death Knights, it's all about properly using your runes to keep yourself alive. You can spend 2 runes on Marrow Rend to generate 3 stacks of Bone Shield. You can have up to 9 stacks, and each stack will increase your haste and decrease incoming damage. Each time you take melee damage, 1 stack is consumed, and Bone Shield will last for 30 seconds or until all charges are consumed. So in general, if you have less than 7 stacks of Bone Shield, you'll want to spend your runes on Marrow Rend. Otherwise, you can spend 1 rune at a time on Heart Strike to deal damage. Just make sure that you're always leaving yourself at least 2 runes in case you need to use Marrow Rend again. You will also be generating runic power, which you will want to spend on Death Strike to deal damage and heal yourself. You can also use Blood Boil on cooldown to deal damage to all enemies nearby and infect them with the Blood Plague disease. Make sure that your enemies are infected with Blood Plague at all times. And once you've acquired your artifact weapon, you will gain the ability Consumption, which you will want to keep on cooldown. You could also spend a rune on Death and Decay, but attacking targets infected by Blood Plague have a chance to activate Crimson Scourge. This will allow your next Death and Decay to not consume a rune. So unless you are fighting multiple enemies, only use Death and Decay whenever Crimson Scourge is active. And that is a very basic rundown on how to play a Blood Death Knight. So now that we understand how the class works, we can take a look at the macro itself. By typing /GS, you will see that there is one macro for blood, and as it says in the description, you're going to use Marrow Rend, Heart Strike, and Death and Decay separately. And this is pretty obvious. All of these 3 abilities involve using runes. And so like Death and Decay you generally only want to use whenever you get the Crimson proc, and then Marrow Rend and Heart Strike you want to use accordingly as necessary. So because of that complexity, it's very hard to macro those abilities. You can't just spam them, you can't really cast sequence them. There's really no easy way to macro those, and so unfortunately you're going to have to manage them separately, but that usually is the case for tank classes. Usually mitigation abilities will have to be managed separately. So if we right click on this macro, we can kind of peek under the hood here and you'll see it does do a couple of things. It doesn't do nearly as much as I would like, but it will help out a little bit. It will use Death Strike, Consumption, and Blood Boil. So it's going to keep Consumption and Blood Boil on cooldown, using those abilities whenever they are available, and then it's going to use Death Strike whenever you have the runic power for it. So that's essentially what it's going to do. And then of course down here, we've got Blood Fury and Anti-Magic Shell under the cooldowns section. I like to put Anti-Magic Shell in there just because it helps generate runic power, and using it as much as possible, in my opinion, is a good idea, especially since you have so many other cooldowns that you can work with to keep yourself alive under dire situations. So that's essentially what the macro is going to do. The idea here is that it's trying to, take care of a couple of abilities, particularly the main, like, rotational abilities, allowing you to focus more on how you're going to spend your runes. And then, of course, whenever Crimson shows up, you're going to use Death and Decay. That's essentially the idea behind this macro. And so it's not going to do everything for you, but that's kind of the way tanks are designed. It's very hard to get everything inside of one macro and make it like super easy and mindless. So that's just a side effect, but it's what you'd have to expect with a tank class, especially one like Blood. So as for talents here, generally what I like to do is pick talents that are easy to work with, easy to use. There are probably other talents here that would be necessary, maybe a little bit more effective, a little bit more efficient or whatever, but I go with ones that are simple. So I generally stick with passive talents, and that's what I've mainly done here. Generally you can go with a passive talent and it won't change up how the macro works, and there are a lot of abilities here that I could have added to the macro, but the problem is how they all work. Pretty much every single one of these abilities, I mean all of them, work in such a way that they could not be macroed. Like this one, for example, Blood Drinker, is one that you do not want to macro because of its channeling, because it uses a rune. You want to be smart about how you use your runes, and that goes for a lot of these other abilities as well. If you look here, like Blood Tap, Rune Tap, both of these abilities, kind of the same idea. You want to use those at the right time, especially if they're like a defensive cooldown and whatnot. So that's essentially the big problem that we have here. Even Mark of Blood, which uses runic power, you want to be smart about how you use that ability, and so it's just one of those things that it makes them really hard to use, and a lot of these are like defensive cooldowns. You want to use them to keep yourself alive or use them under the right circumstances, and that is essentially what made it very difficult. Bone Storm especially was one that I was hoping that I could macro, but because it uses anywhere from 10 to 100 runic power, it just wouldn't work because you want to spend the most runic power on it. So that's a problem with an ability like that, even though it has a cooldown, and many of these abilities do have cooldowns, and so normally, under normal circumstances, I could just macro them in, but unfortunately, because of how they are, the nature of the ability and how they're supposed to be used, you just can't macro them, and that was just the trouble that I was having with trying to macro Blood. So Blood is very hard to macro, but the idea here is what you're going to get is a simple macro that does a couple of things, keeps those abilities going as you spam it, and then allowing you to focus your attention on using your runes accordingly. As powerful as these macros are, they are far from perfect. So, if you want to play the game at a high level and get the most out of your class, I highly recommend that you play the game without these macros. But, if you'd like to get started with Gnome Sequencer Enhanced, you can do so by downloading and installing the mod. A link can be found in the description below. Along with it, you will find paste bin links for any macros featured in this video. If you'd like to use them, simply click the link and you'll be taken to a raw paste bin of the macro. Select the entire macro, copy, log into the appropriate class, type /GS to open the Gnome Sequencer screen, click on Import, paste the macro into the available space, make sure that Automatically Create Macro Icon is checked, and click Import. You can now drag the icon to your action bar and the macro is ready to be used. If you followed all the steps correctly, the macro should be working fine. If something isn't working, start over and make sure that you follow all the steps correctly. If you are having further issues, I recommend that you check out the mod page or contact the mod's author for more information. If you enjoyed this video, let me know by hitting that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. You can also subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter at TheKephas to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. Thanks for watching, have a wonderful day, this is Kephas, until next time.